All right, guys, Anthony with Austin Historical Weapons Guild here in Vigilante, our new home away from home. Tonight we're going to be starting with some Dusak from Joachim Meyer. Again, I'll be playing with a Messer, same general idea, same general principle. One edge-handed weapon, fairly short, one edge. This doesn't have the knuckle bow, obviously, but principally the same thing. Definitely good enough for what we're diving into tonight. What I want to start off with is the roarer cut. And this is something we'll see in the Dusak section of Meyer. And there's not a whole lot of description and motion to it. I think it's kind of fun, kind of interesting, because it's definitely talking about a weird sort of attack, weird sort of action. We want the sword to make noise. We want it to be loud. We want it to come in my mind, with that some sort of weird crossing angle. We're using the back edge of the blade, and we're aiming at kind of the inside of the forearm, the elbow, anything like this, of an opponent who's gone up high. And that's kind of one of the major points of this action, of this cut, is we want our opponent going high and starting to drive down so they come down, kind of making this opening, if you kind of imagine, kind of up here. This is a bit low for that, so we're shooting past this for this demonstration, but just being aware that our target is kind of the inner arm, the elbow of someone who's coming in with a high cut, probably bringing back down, kind of looking for this sort of angle, breaking from there. So the cut itself is fairly straightforward, starting in a kind of a lower stance, bringing that back edge, and again, coming up and across. I'll miss this so I can kind of demonstrate. Going up and across with this. Notably, we're dragging our right foot across. Meyer calls it as bringing it to your opponent's right side, but really coming across with this motion comes to steps. I'm coming across through there. So again, the core motion that we're starting off with tonight, this roaring cut. I don't know, I really doubt the headsets are picking up the noise well enough at all. But really working from here, coming across, bringing it up and through. Meyer kind of goes on to say then, wind in front of your head, get the blade back to cover and parry, whether it's kind of dropping here, whether he's talking about bringing it back to a steer-like position, definitely feels situational. But as I'm kind of, again, assuming the target is high, bring this up, cutting through, coming here doesn't feel bad, turning into it back again, using our hips to really drive our body back across instead of trying to pull our arm, which we just kind of flung across ourselves. But all that really seems to tie in nicely to the idea of this motion. He does kind of talk about this cut having a big windup, coming high, dropping low to cut across. I really think, especially because this is in the how do I make a cut section, that's really more of a cue of how to make the cut move, how to get the dynamics and motion he really wants out of it. I'm not convinced that every time you throw a roaring cut, you need to come behind your head and pull through there. I really do think that if you practice that motion, you can start it from here. You can get the same amount of power and noise coming across as you step through, as you move across. That's kind of the roaring cut. There's not a whole lot of plays in the Dusak. I think there's one or two he talks about that really talk about applications and uses of it. It's just kind of, here's this cut, he calls it out once or twice, but there's not a whole lot by itself that we can start doing and playing with. That said, that in mind, and the goal set in mind, I'm going to play with a little bit of how I think we can start using it before you start branching into more weapons, more applications that I think will be more familiar and make more sense. So one of the obvious, again, we're expecting a cut coming through, coming down, very easy, intuitive, right? I just make this cut, I catch as I'm stepping out. I'm really catching and driving this, whether it's cut, whether it's the arm, driving it through. And again, I'm not looking to make a second cut wrapping around. He's saying, bring this back in front, leaving yourself covered and protected. If we do manage to miss or they manage to avoid or things like that, by coming all the way around, there's a huge amount of time and opening that we're creating for ourselves. So really making sure we're in the habit of, as I come across, bringing this back, right, or stepping back through, something like that, to keep the weapon up in front of your face instead of bringing it around your head for a second time in short succession. So really kind of focusing on starting, missing, pulling back, recapturing kind of that center position. Even if you do hit, right? Still coming through here. And really diving into that more is if I do strike a target, I do catch a target, and I come here, getting used to this kind of catching, pulling the blade back, lines up for more attacks, right? If I kind of plan on hitting this, pulling off, and cutting through, it really takes away our ability to quickly follow up with a new attack. So really getting this habit of, as I'm here, as I step across, I need to be able to keep this where I want it so I can press out, making more strikes or whatever else needs to kind of show up. As I said, there's not a whole lot that Meyer gives us in this. So I'm going to set this down for a minute and go on to some other weapons, see how those pull out, and then depending how it works, we'll come back. So obviously, easy application shows up in Longsword. And I believe it's Ringek, Goliath. He talks about fencing from the sweeps. We've talked about striking or the slicings, the sweeping, actions like that. But there's not a whole lot that we know other than you start low and you have some actions. And that's kind of, your big kind of clear, going back through. You can clear, cut back to the same line. I've honestly never been a big fan of them. I've had very limited success making them work because we don't get as much input, at least in my recollection. It's been a while since I looked at them, but we don't have as much input on how they're applied, what we're doing with them. So I think it'd be fun to really take this kind of roaring cut, which is doing the same exact principle starting concept, and start applying it to those kinds of low elbow type positions, right? So fencing from the sweeps, fencing from low, we're really expecting these kind of low, picking up, driving through, setting up motions. I've never really looked at kind of coming through and throwing the sword across more, right? So instead of this kind of super polite, good cutting mechanics, good structure, pulling through like this, what if instead this is really turning into this kind of nasty, I'm kind of almost flattening their blade. I'm not sure you can see the difference here, right? From here, kind of flat across and bring it back across and through. So really focusing on here, or if I'm on my other side, I can really emulate that stepping across with my right foot. If I'm here, instead of, again, this big cut here, I can really make this strike happen. Then I'm also able to, if I take those same principles, kind of collapse and drop in a much quicker strike. So I'm no longer looking to kind of fence here, come up, and either cut back down. We talk about a knock rising as being very slow, very inefficient, something that gets you caught up and something your opponent is supposed to be able to exploit, right? So if I come up and miss, and I just try to cut back down, I'm not really taking proper precautions. But if I can start doing this motion where I'm making that similar cut to the roaring cut, where instead of a nice line again, I kind of make, I wonder if I can even make noise again on this. So here, really just kind of letting this come through and then redirecting the point, coming back to cover, maybe back across that way. It's really starting to make that start to happen. So if we follow the Dusek play more explicitly, let me start right foot forward, get the feel of it. I'd want to get my opponent to go high. I'd start high, circle around my head, right foot's coming across, making this big kind of swooping motion, using more of the flat, kind of flicking the edge up, but far less so than a normal rising cut with the back edge. So really looking at this as a sweep, and it's much, much easier, honestly, to start being able to pull this through, changing my angles, changing my pressure. So playing against this kind of, at the moment, it's more of a long point position, right? Starting there the same way. I want to come up, I want to catch, and then redirect over in one motion. So again, coming through and pressing out. I switch my V. The same thing becomes much, much easier as I'm able to make that batting motion and redirect into the full strike. Again, we can compare that to kind of trying to come up with a false edge rising cut. Not only is it harder to catch their blade, I'm way more out of position than with the other strike. Yeah, even coming across where I have a better angle, I'm still really struggling to get that blade presence back. So it's definitely, in my opinion, a very good, useful interpretation of really thinking this as being, instead of this nice proper cut, kind of stepping, rotating the blade almost to the point where, again, you want bad wind, you want noise, you want something that kind of, and again, I doubt it's going to happen with these, but we're looking for that bad edge alignment, things like that. And I'll go on to say that bad edge alignment isn't inherently a bad thing. If you've been watching the Jude Liu stuff we've been going through, we see very distinctly him calling out with the Vector or the inverter, where he wants us to keep the edge completely vertical while we're coming up at an angle. So we have precedent for making motions with a sword which aren't being done to cut. We aren't doing this to wound, we're doing this to set something up later and setting ourselves in a good position. So if we can start manipulating our blade, doing weird things with the motion, to make it easier to control, easier to set back online, I think it's definitely a good thing we can pull across the systems, especially from Meyer, who's known for having what everyone says is one system across multiple weapons and doing things the same way. There's no reason in my head not to start taking this idea, this kind of roaring strike. So instead of making these cuts, long edge, false edge, whichever, we're not looking for the engagement out of the bind, we're looking to catch them when they're going up high, bring in this type of action, which lets us redirect, lets us clear a path and then drop our point in place, seems very in touch, in tune, in time with things Meyer's doing anyway. And just purely for entertainment, I did bring out a rapier. I fully expect this to go poorly, but that's why we experiment, right? So I try new things, see how things bleed out, see how things work. Like really make that same motion. So as a, scholar of Fabris is the politest thing I can call myself. I'm always thinking about, first of all, not cutting. Second of all, I want to make sure my arms extend, my points on line, and the odds of my opponent going high and cutting in low are very low, and I've got plenty of good ways to deal with that. So I'm really not getting a lot of those same motions I'd expect, right? I'm not going to be able to cut up and cut across or anything like that. I'm definitely not going to circle my head to make my starting action. But there's definitely a lot in this play, in this technique, that blends nicely into Fabris from the start. For instance, stepping well off to the right side is something Fabris is always doing, always demonstrating, even if he's not saying explicitly. All the images in his book show someone who's almost in profile here, leaning out this way. So I'm curious, if we have that concept coming along, what can I be doing with this motion, right? What it feels bad for this, that I can start to make fall into play with some of the Fabris stuff we've seen so far. So first instinct, first feeling as I'm going through this, right? I'm in this nice position, this is a nice, quick way of kind of snapping in to first. It's definitely not as big clearing as the other motions are, but just emphasizing that I should be coming up here and striking and placing. And maybe this is just the only thing to pull away from this is a good, interesting way to cavazione into first, right? So if my opponent, and it's a little too steep of an angle, but if my opponent is out extended in front of me, and I want to get to the other side, I can easily come over here, make change that line as I come in with that lunge, right? Not something I would ever normally think to do with a rapier, but I can easily flip this up, turn this over, and I have a much quicker, faster point control way of doing it. I don't feel like I'm breaking Fabrice's rules. I'm not lunging or flicking the sword. I'm not sitting here couched and throwing this. I'm keeping my arm straight, turning over as I rise, striking through to first. So that feels like it's a good and useful application. If I start doing it from the outside, the same thing, I can really start to get up and underneath fast and quickly. Probably generous to call that motion kind of a roaring cut, but I still think that intent applies. We start looking at it from the reverse side, starting the same motions we had before. We're starting to come up with this kind of cut, and instead we drop it out. If I come through here, again, I'm able to get that sort of control position and locking and isolating. So maybe a bit of a stretch, but it's definitely an interesting exercise. Take something that we fully expect not to apply because we're no longer making a cut. We're no longer doing traditionally be kind of this type of motion where I come across, bring the tip back in line and attack. You really shouldn't be doing that in rapier. Your opponent shouldn't be going up high and making a cut at you in rapier. Like there's lots of unrealistic setups for this, but I think the mechanics are sound, the principles are the same, and if you start modifying the motion to make sense in the system, so instead of making this a cut, make this a I want to change where I am, I'm going to turn over and lead this through, it does become fairly effective, fairly useful when applied within that mentality. So I think that's going to be it tonight. Definitely, if there's more insider questions on this, feel free to let me know. I think it was more successful than I expected, especially with the rapier. But again, just that roaring cut, and I'll go back to the Messer / Dusak. Going to demonstrate again. What we're looking for is our opponent's going to go up high, cutting from above, cutting from there, whether it's at distance, whether we're in close in Krieg in the war. As they do so, I'm going to grabbing around my head, dropping my arm, stepping across, and making that displacement. Not looking to make a clean cut with my false edge, but really trying to make the sword roar, make the weapon roar. He does kind of talk about reversing your grip on the Dusak. We're kind of in this grip here, and it kind of pulls through. But we're looking to use that false edge to come across and strike across from there. And once we're here, making sure we can bring the tip back around whichever way it needs to be to parry and protect and work from the bind and the distance. So again, hope that's good. Hope that makes sense. If there are questions or feedback, feel free to comment below, reach out on Facebook or email. Otherwise, Friday we expect another Fabrice video. And we're back on Monday with some more of the Jude Liu. Thanks, guys.